So this is part 22 in our Wild Harvest edibles series, and just a reminder that as we do that, that there are also medicinal components associated with almost everything we put in our mouth, whether that be for good or for bad. So as we talk about those aspects, as well as the edibility aspects, just a reminder that anything that we talk about is educational in nature, and that if you feel like it's something you want to incorporate into your health regime, that you would do your own due diligence and also seek out a healthcare provider that has a similar philosophy of care that you share. And Hippocrates said, "Let food be your medicine, and your medicine be your food." And right along with Thomas Edison saying that the doctor of the future will give no medicine. Mrs. White in Ministry of Healing, not Ministry of Healing, Medical Ministry, page 126, I believe, says that if we follow the laws of nature, that essentially we will set all drugs aside, the laws of God and of health that he provided with us in nature. So Thomas Edison was way ahead of his time. Ellen White was way ahead of her time, and God is always right on time.
Recording.
So today we're going to look at curly dock. Rumex crispus is the genus and species name of curly dock. It's a very well-known weed. It's also known as yellow dock or sour dock, narrow-leaved dock, or curled dock. This is how it looks on the right there out in a field. It's a very prominent, very green, fairly obvious plant once it gets to size. Has a good sized taproot that is used more medicinally than edible, but it is very difficult to uproot and takes a pretty good shovel to do that. The leaves in the fall kind of take on a reddish tinge to them. You want to use them for edible purposes when they're in the green stage. You can see down in the lower right there a handful of the seeds. That's the time when they start going dark that the leaves start to turn a little bit of color too. It'll pretty much just die away through the winter, and all you'll see is the seed stalks with their seed heads sticking up. So you can use the leaves, the roots, as well as the seeds. The flowers are green and are not very showy, but they do turn into the seeds that can be actually pounded into a flour and used as a flour substitute. The leaves can be cooked as you would spinach or other vegetables that you cook, leafy greens, and they can be eaten raw. The young leaves are more tender and more tasty. You can use them in a salad or just eat them on their own. They are going to have a little bit of a bitter taste, especially the older they get, because they do contain oxalic acid, as well as tannins. So those tannins can have, those are probably some of the things that give it its medicinal qualities, the tannins, although even the medicinal qualities are most often utilized from the root tissue. So the primary medicinal component is the root, and we'll talk about that here next. So here's a great example of the fresh new leaves coming up. It hasn't shown up and shot up its flower stalk yet on the lower left. And then a flower stalk that has the full seeds in head, nice brownish reddish. And you can see all the stages of that plant on the right side. The kind of the basal rosette of the leaf structures and the green flower parts, and then as they go red, and then the seeds up close there. So those are all the different stages of the plant. So from a medicinal standpoint, it functions in a purifying capacity, so purifying and cleansing herb. All the plants may be used, but the roots have the strongest health properties associated with them. Interestingly enough, the author that I was gleaning a bunch of the information from mentioned that her grandmother utilized the crushed curly dock as a poultice for stinging nettle, and helps to mitigate the stings of stinging nettle. And typically they grow in similar areas, so they're often found growing in close proximity. It's a useful treatment for constipation and diarrhea. So it's a gentle and safe laxative effect for mild constipation. It's also good for relieving diarrhea. It happens to be dose dependent and has a couple other things that can depend on its efficacy or its beneficial nature. The soil conditions as well at the time of harvest can impact the benefit. And that's something that you probably have to play with in your particular locale and play with on the dosing of your particular variety that you have. So it's not a hard and fast kind of a dose suggestion. So it's helpful for mitigating skin issues. Use it as a tea, as a wash, for cleansing the skin, for things like rashes or wounds or other types of skin conditions. You can use it internally for its health enhancing effects. So a tonic is anything that helps the body and enhances it and moves it towards health. So using the dried or pounded root, you can put that into a salve or a poultice. Here's a picture of the root that's been pulled up and is in hand. There's kind of a yellowish quality to it. It's a nice tap root. If you break that tap root off in its harvest, it will resprout from the crown and end up kind of like a dandelion in that respect. We'll just continue to have more and more plant material coming from the top of that root crown. The powdered root can be used in its own right, like powder, on sores and wounds and other skin conditions, in addition to using it in its moist form in a tea, as in a wash. Otherwise, it's be added to a poultice of some kind. It's also a beneficial and useful detoxification agent. So it has a bitter taste for it, and it's very helpful for the gallbladder and the liver. So the gallbladder and the liver are intrinsically and very closely connected in that the gallbladder is embedded in the liver tissue. The liver actually creates and makes cholesterol, cholesterol that our body may need, does need for cellular structures. And then the gallbladder actually helps to emulsify fats and cholesterol from bile, which essentially is a cholesterol derivative. And that only gets activated when a person is consuming fats. So a person on a low-fat diet, their gallbladder isn't going to be functioning, isn't going to be required to do much at all. But someone who's eating lots of fats, they're going to have a very active gallbladder and may end up with gallstones. And those are typically asymptomatic unless they get to a certain size. But then they can actually be therapeutic in the sense that if someone realizes that it's because of their high-fat diet that they're stimulating their gallstones, if they go to a low-fat diet, their gallstones become asymptomatic. So it's better to not take them out, because when you do take gallstones out, you compromise OD, which is a little muscle that controls the release of the bile into the digestive tract. And without that muscle there, you get a constant drip of bile uncontrolled into your GI, not your GI, but your intestinal tract, and that can cause irritation and potentially inflammation, and maybe even leading to cancer at some point. So it's best to keep your gallbladder intact, and to detoxify it once in a while, you can use curly dock as a benefit for doing that. It increases bile production for temporary periods of time and aids in the cleansing of the structures of the liver and the gallbladder. So anything that is benefited by a body detox, any organ, can benefit from the presence of or use of curly dock. So you can combine it with burdock for an even more powerful cleansing role. So that's another dock species that we'll also talk about at a future time, but has burrs that are very pronounced on it that can cling to you about the size of a marble. Here's a diagram of curly dock again. So it's a black and white drawing of the leaf there, and then the seed stalk in its green stage. And the flower parts are very, very small, kind of the winged seed portions. The seed there is in yellow in the center part of the seed winged seed coat. So when harvesting it, you want to harvest the roots in the fall and then dry it for use at a later time. That way it's had its maximum amount of time to store the starches and the qualities in the root. If you harvest it in the spring, it's going to be hard to see, and there's not going to be as much actually stored up in the tissue. It'll be drawn down through the winter. You want to dig up the entire plant, wash it, hang it to dry, but you want to cut that root up before you dry it, because it's easiest to cut when it's moist. It becomes very, very tough and fibrous when attempting to cut it when dry. So do that cutting up into smaller, finer pieces for using in decoctions and tinctures and teas before you dry it. So the leaves can be harvested all through the growing seasons, the spring and the summer, as you need them. The fresh curled leaves that you can see here are best. You want to avoid the brown ones or ones that are buggy, and then also avoid areas where they may be along roadways or in fields that may be sprayed. The main agent that they probably will have been sprayed with is a glyphosate bearing product called Roundup, and the glyphosate has been implicated in a number of various deleterious roles. It functions as a chelator. That's one of the ways that it functions in killing plants, is by chelating the minerals that those plants need to survive. And in doing that, we get our minerals from the plants, and it chelates them in us too, particularly sulfates. And there are other minerals as well that get chelated. And by tying those up, it can create a vitamin D deficiency, and that vitamin D deficiency is exacerbated by the fact that the glyphosate can create light toxicity in the skin. And so people have more sensitive skin. And so that's, don't go out in the sun, get burned easy, and then the vitamin D just doesn't get produced like it ought to be produced. Also can cause arterial inflammation and create an absence of the sulfate that actually shepherds LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol, out of the body. So glyphosate is a bad actor, and it creates the toxicity and inflammation that we find in blood vessels. And also it creates a loss of gelled or structured water, which is the type of water that is making up the interior portion of our cells. It's called the cytosol, and it's a gel-like matrix that is essentially water-based. So there's basically 4 different stages of water. There's liquid, gas, solid, and gel. It's kind of a 4th state of water that has been recently understood or being learned about as far as its function in health and the maintaining of wellness. So glyphosate messes with a lot of different things. And the only way to avoid that is to eat as clean as possible and eating organic produce and food and things. Processed food is very difficult to avoid glyphosate unless you're actually buying strictly 100% organic. And even then there's possibilities. So, but that's a way to lower the glyphosate load as much as possible. And it does tend to be cumulative in nature. So that all being said, just to make sure that you're avoiding places that Roundup has been used on any plant that you would harvest for an edible wild, particularly along roadways or in places like lawns that people may be using weed killers. So a tincture that one could make from curly dock is using the fresh curly dock root and vegetable glycerin. Have some of that on hand. The old way is using 80 proof vodka or other alcohol to make the tincture. That's the most common way to do that. But the vegetable glycerin is a viable alternative that doesn't have an alcohol base and is better for people in the long run. Use a glass jar with a tight fitting lid. So then grate, you can use like a ginger grater or another type of grater to grate the fresh root into the glass jar. Once you've got that filled up, then you can fill that jar with glycerin and make sure the root is covered completely. Then you're going to steep that for 6 to 8 weeks and be shaking it gently every day to facilitate the extraction process. Then after that 6 to 8 week tincture extraction, strain out the root pieces and then store that tincture, which is the fluid portion, in a glass jar. Be sure to label it and date it, store it in a cool, dark place. And depending on how it's prepared, and storage conditions can last up to 7 years in duration. And this again is a picture of the curly dock in its early stages there with the roots and all the greenery. And then there's also the the field version of it that you would see as it's popped up its seed heads. Those seed heads can be harvested individually. Just take your hand and just strip them up and collect them, as well as the leaves. You see some dry and kind of turning color leaves there, as well as some kind of buggy eaten leaves there. So that's the curly dock. Another one of the things that you can put into your edible and medicinal toolbox for use when you see it available, and or if there aren't other pharmacia or other types of things available for your use.